I fear you find me in an unusual predicament. You see, I would much prefer to be the one steering this narrative, weaving the threads of my own destiny, yet here I am, a victim of my own success. Or perhaps it's hubris. This is Foundation, and I am Lord Bara. On this day, I'm a captive, but not of chains or iron, no. My prison is one of responsibility and notoriety, and the bars are lined with soft cushions, and the road ahead a cruel irony paved by my own triumphs. I beg your indulgence. Before you pass judgment or attempt to unravel this mystery, allow me to deliver some much-needed exposition. You must understand, I, once so firmly rooted in the affairs of Barat, find myself under the custody of the King's army, en route to the capital. But I cannot begin with the jarring moment the soldiers arrived, or even the unsettling decree that upended my carefully curated world. No, to make sense of my plight, I must take you back to where it all began. A moment of anticipation and pride, when I was preparing to receive the esteemed delegation of the Lady of Northbury. Yes, everything had been coming together splendidly. Barat had never looked finer. Banners were crisp and unfurled, the streets swept clean of their usual detritus, every detail, from the fresh flowers adorning the square to the finest feast our town could muster, had been arranged to perfection. My focus was unwavering, for this visit carried the weight of diplomacy, alliances, and perhaps a touch of romance. And yet, you'll soon learn, even the best laid plans are naught but the dreams of peasants. To truly grasp the weight of what I'm about to recount, you must first understand the gravity of the visit in question. Allow me, dear listener, to lay bare my innermost fears, those whispering doubts that gnawed at the edge of my confidence. For you see, this was no ordinary reception. The negotiations we embarked upon were conducted beneath the shadow of strained circumstances, fraught with tensions that could fracture at the slightest provocation. Northbury, a powerful neighbour, had long been courted by Middle, a union that, should it solidify, would reshape the balance of power in ways Barat cannot afford to ignore. Alliances are forming, whispering winds of change through the valleys and hills of our lands, and yet the future remains clouded, as uncertain as the weather on a winter's morn. The feud between Northbury and Middle, once confined to diplomatic disputes and border skirmishes, has spilled like an overturned wine goblet onto the very streets of our town. Its stain is visible on the bruised faces of market-goers and the hushed laments of merchants whose livelihoods are disrupted by unrest. My dear friend and trusted captain of my modest armies has laboured tirelessly to keep those powder-keg situations from erupting into full-blown violence. That such matters have been contained at all is a testament to his discipline, though even he admits the effort leaves him more threadbare than an old cloak. It appears, however, that Middle for all their pious machinations and self-righteous rhetoric, are moving to lay claim to lands that are not theirs to take. Their emissaries speak of divine providence, while their actions are those of conquest, subtle, perhaps, yet unmistakable. And so, Bara stands on the precipice of a decision, one that will ripple through time, for once it's made, it cannot be undone. Do we seek to align ourselves with Northbury, forging a bond that may secure our borders, but at what cost? Or do we resist, clinging to our independence and risking the ire of powers far greater than our modest town? These questions, friend, weighed upon me with an almost physical presence, a burden I bore even as I endeavoured to present an image of a leader unshaken. Little did I know, the events about to unfold would render these questions moot, sweeping me into a storm beyond my control. Scattered leaves and debris left by the morning breeze led me down the stone steps of the manor entrance. Something in the crisp air, perhaps it was the sight of old Eliza sweeping with a worn broom, or perhaps I simply needed the distraction. The Northbury delegate had arrived in the night, and I'd not yet formally received them. This wasn't a problem in of itself, but I was most hungover from an evening drinking with Arnaldo and some lady friends. I donned my long coat and I began sweeping alongside her, falling into the meditative cadence of bristles on stone amidst the creeping shadows of the morning sun. I'd drifted so deep into my own thoughts it was Eliza's elbow in my rib that pulled me from the surface of them. Turning, I found her observing me, Lady Northbury. In a muted, yellow dawn light beneath the archway, her cheeks were as pink as a rose. Her gaze moving between the broom in my hand and my face, she seemed ill at ease. I gave her a polite nod, trying not to appear too self-conscious. "Lady Northbury," I said, handing the broom to Eliza. "You're up early." She hesitated slightly before stepping fully into the courtyard, her movements graceful yet deliberate. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, though her eyes betrayed her curiosity. "I wasn't expecting to find you here." I brushed my hands together. "And where should I be?" I smiled lightly. She straightened before she spoke. "I thought lords typically leave such tasks to their staff." I must have laughed, more at myself than her remark. Perhaps they do, but some tasks, mundane as they seem, have their own rewards. Besides, I've grown rather fond of this courtyard. Her brow furrowed, as though trying to reconcile the man before her with her expectations, no doubt. "It's unexpected," she admitted. "In my experience, Lady Northbury," I said, gesturing to the path leading to the mouth of the manor entrance, "expectations often get in the way of discovery. Would you care to walk with me?" We were greeted by some of the townsfolk as we strolled down the street. A nod here, a wave there, each greeting met with a name and a kind word. Thomas, from the cobbler's, tipped his hat. Aldith, from the bakery, beamed on her way to the shop, and even dour old Mrs. Hart offered a curt nod from behind her cart of turnips. Lady Northbury seemed to observe it all with a quiet fascination, her steps falling in rhythm with mine. She seemed to grow more at ease with each exchange, though whenever I turned to look at her, she straightened slightly. Finally, she broke her silence with the most innocent of questions. How do you remember everybody's name? It's not something I'd ever thought about, if I'm honest. I simply said, I love Bara Town. She halted, her eyes soaking in the wet thatch of the roofs and the crooked fences lining the street. You love Bara Town? She said, her voice soft but with a tone of sincerity I hadn't heard before. Yes, it's easy to remember the names of the things you love, I added. We resumed our walk, the market's morning hum growing louder as we approached. I caught a glimpse of her studying me, her gaze curious yet hesitant, as if trying to determine whether she could trust the man she had just informally met. It's true, I added after a pause. Every name, every face, every story, they're the threads that weave this place together. I couldn't love Bara without loving its people, flaws and all. She gave the faintest smile, and for the first time, I thought I saw a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. You're not at all what I expected, Lord Bara, she said quietly. Oh, really? How so? I asked, echoing her same informal tone. That, she replied, straightening her posture once again, remains to be seen. She glanced towards the market ahead, where merchants bustled and called to passers-by, the smell of fresh bread mingling with the crisp air. I suppose, she began hesitantly, there's a certain charm to that, knowing a place so well, loving it, despite its flaws. It's not in spite of its flaws, I corrected her. It's because of them. Its people, its streets, its seasons. They're part of the story. I don't know what I'd do without it. The next few days were, to put it lightly, laborious. Endless hours were consumed in practical, if not altogether, thrilling discussions of trade agreements and the prospect of future partnerships. Bara had been overly generous in past dealings with Northbury, and they knew it. This generosity had come at no small cost to us. Strained coffers, tightened belts, and whispered complaints from merchants who felt the pinch. Yet, it was a calculated risk, a gambit designed to compel Northbury to make concessions now. Under normal circumstances, I might have entrusted these negotiations to Ashmond. He's a capable man, sharp-eyed and shrewd, with an instinct for knowing precisely where to press for advantage. I trust him implicitly, but not this time. This time, the stakes were too high, and the potential for missteps too great. By the third day of talks, the strain was palpable, not only in the discussions but in the faces around the table. A decision was made to step away briefly to break the rhythm of the tense dialogue. A group of us, including the Lady of Northbury and I, rode out together to a modest hunting ground a few leagues from the town. The spoils, as anticipated, were meagre. Our game was hare and fowl. Hardly a feast fit for a hall, but the distraction was welcome. For a fleeting moment, the weight of diplomacy was lifted, replaced by the earthly simplicity of the hunt and the shared camaraderie of a mutual pursuit. By the end of the fifth day, however, the fatigue had returned, amplified by yet another particularly inconclusive conversation, this one centered around raw iron, a resource vital to both our interests. It left me restless and drained. Seeking a moment of solitude, I found myself loitering on the valley bridge as the sun began to dip below the hills. I could see the fishermen were hauling in their nets, their silhouettes framed against the amber glow of the fading light. There was a quiet rhythm to their work, a simplicity that stood in sharp contrast to the endless complexities of negotiation. I leaned against the bridge's wooden railing, savouring the stillness, when I felt a presence approaching me from behind. I turned to find the Lady of Northbury straightening herself as I did. She stepped up beside me, her gaze falling to the water below. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching comfortably between us. It was as though we had both agreed, without words, to leave the burdens of politics behind, for a little while at least. "You look troubled," she said at last, her voice low and even, carrying just enough warmth to feel almost personal. The air was still, and the last rays of the sun spread across the sky like a painting you knew you would never see again. "Troubled?" I repeated, glancing at her with as wry a smile as I could muster. "I suppose that's one way you could describe it, though I imagine you must feel the same." Her lips curved faintly, though her eyes betrayed a weariness that matched my own. "Perhaps," she said, "but I've found that the weight is easier to bear when shared." Ah, and there it was, a subtle invitation, an opening that could lead to something more meaningful than the carefully rehearsed words we'd exchanged over the past 5 days. The question now was whether to accept it or not. "Whatever happened to the gentleman we returned to you?" I asked, breaking the stillness with a casual tone, though my curiosity was genuine. She gazed over the little boats below as though weighing her answer. "Oh, the one who accosted a tailor of yours, was it? Yes, I remember him. He's no longer at court," she replied. Her voice carried a note of exasperation, though it was softened by an undertone of regret. "And I apologize for that." I waved the apology away lightly, though the memory of the incident lingered. "I'm sure it wasn't your fault. He seemed blinded by love, if I recall correctly." "Love?" she repeated, almost to herself, her tone laced with skepticism. Then she turned to me, a single brow arched. "There's that word again. I'm beginning to think you don't take me seriously, Lord Bara." Her accusation was light, more playful than pointed, but I didn't miss the challenge. "Oh, on the contrary," I said, fixing her gaze with my own, steady and deliberate. The moment stretched between us, the sounds of the river and the distant voices fading to a quiet hum. "There's nothing more serious than love." For a moment, she seemed taken aback, the playful air between us shifting to something heavier, something charged. Her expression softened, and the faintest smile touched her lips, as if she were weighing the words against her own doubts. "Is that so?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. "It is," I said simply. "Love has the power to inspire, to destroy, to unite, to divide. It is both the greatest strength and the deepest vulnerability one can have. To underestimate it would be folly." Her gaze lingered on mine, searching for something I wasn't sure I could name. Whatever it was, she seemed to find it, or at least enough of it to let the moment linger a little longer. Then, with a tilt of her head and a knowing glint in her eye, she said, "Well, perhaps you are more serious than I give you credit for after all." The tension broke, and we both laughed. A genuine, unguarded moment that felt rare amongst the careful dance of diplomacy. I won't lie to you, dear listener. Not everything I say is carefully planned or calculated. Indeed, my next words surprise me as much as they may surprise you now. Do you like games of chance? I asked, the question tumbling out before I could think twice. Her eyes lit up with curiosity, a flicker of intrigue that hinted at her competitive spirit beneath her poised exterior. Games of chance? That depends, she said, a sly smile curving her lips. Are you asking because you intend to win, or because you hope to impress me? Perhaps both, I admitted with a grin, and with that, the mood shifted once more. The remainder of the night was spent in the company of my good friend Arnaldo. He provided us with warmth, wine, and the simple pleasures of good fire and finer company. Lady Eleanor of Northbury, for all her regal bearing, softened over the course of the evening. It was not unlike watching a rose petal fall delicately into the palm of your hand, graceful, inevitable, and yet no less mesmerizing. At some point, we were alone, and as the fire burned low and the evening ebbed into night, I found myself marvelling at the unexpected turns life had taken. Lady Eleanor, once merely a diplomatic counterpart, had become something more, a mystery unfolding, a game of chance in its own right. And as we retired to my quarters, my thoughts lingered not on negotiations or alliances, but on her smile and the echo of her laughter still ringing in the quiet halls of my mind. Now, some call me controversial. I know, a man of opinions and actions that are not always met with universal approval, but I'll say this in all honesty and from much experience, that all women, despite their protestations, desire to be conquered. The next morning, I was rudely awoken, a sharp knock echoing through the quiet halls of the manor. Groggy, but alert, I scrambled to dress, slipping into a hastily chosen tunic and breeches, forgoing the usual ceremonial flair. Whatever this was, it clearly couldn't wait. As I descended the stairs, the air was thick with tension, the kind that clings to your skin and refuses to be ignored, and the entrance, Sir Philip Thorne stood, clutching his riding gloves so tightly I thought he might tear them. His face, pale and drawn, betrayed a man who had seen or heard something most unsettling. "My lord," he began, voice barely steady, "you must come at once." I raised my arms, more curious than alarmed. "And what, pray, has roused you so early, Sir Philip?" "It's Captain Coleman," he said, almost blurting the words out. "He sent for you. There are soldiers at the gates, armed to the teeth, en masse." The weight of the words sank in immediately. Soldiers at our gates. There was no simple diplomatic visit or passing patrol that I expected. No one brought an army to Bara without intention. "And you know nothing more?" I pressed, already pulling on a cloak. "Nothing, my lord," he admitted. "Only that Captain Coleman deemed it urgent enough to wake you, and half the town." Well, I wasn't dressed for such a reception. I wasn't prepared to greet an armed force on my doorstep, but leadership often called for improvisations. There are moments when hesitation breeds chaos, and this was not the time for second-guessing. I nodded curtly to Sir Philip. Then we act swiftly. As we stepped into the brisk morning air, the first rays of sunlight glinting off the rooftops, I felt the familiar churn of anticipation and resolve in my chest. Whatever awaited at the gates, I would meet it head-on. The town flashed by in a blur. The world a tapestry of fleeting impressions as I rode with purpose. The scent of wet hay mingled with coal smoke lingered faintly on the cool morning air, a reminder of the waking village I knew so well. Market stalls still shuttered, their colourful tarps sagging with dew. Sir Philip rode close at my flank, his unease palpable. As we approached the mustering grounds near the gates, the scene unfolded with stark clarity. There they stood, 40 men in tight formation, their postures rigid despite the weariness etched into their faces. Dust and travel stains marked their armour and cloaks, but it was the colours they bore that seized my attention. Bold, unmistakable, and unwelcome. My stomach churned, though I kept my composure as best I could. Their presence here could mean only one thing: command. An edict. A summons that would leave no room for negotiation. Coleman, ever the sentinel, had already positioned himself between the soldiers and our people, his dark cloak blending into the early morning shadows. As I dismounted, he stepped forward to meet me, his usual calm and rasped tone carrying a weight of unspoken gravity. "My lord," he said, bowing slightly but maintaining his gaze. His face betrayed no alarm, yet the tension in his stance was evident. "Captain," I replied, evenly, brushing the dust from my cloak. "You've called me here for what appears to be a rather urgent matter." Coleman nodded, his eyes flicking briefly to the king's banner swaying in the crisp morning breeze. "Indeed, their captain awaits your audience." I glanced towards the soldiers' ranks, their captain seated astride a warhorse at the centre of the formation. His face was shadowed beneath a steel helm, his bearing exuded authority. I took a moment to assess the situation, noting the silence among the troops, the wary glances cast towards the gathering townsfolk just beyond the edges of the grounds. I turned back to Captain Coleman, lowering my voice. "And what do they want, Captain?" He simply shook his head. "He will not say. I suggest you tread carefully. These are not mere couriers." I gave a single resolute nod. "Then let us not keep them waiting." With that, I strode towards the wall of soldiers, my head held high and my steps deliberate. The men fixed their eyes on me like prey. An armoured man on a warhorse is, by design, a spectacle meant to unnerve, and I'd be lying if I claimed it didn't have the effect on me. Between us, dear listener, I was intimidated. There's a unique weight in the presence of a steel-clad authority, particularly when accompanied by the restlessness and the shifting of so many boots, and the creak of leather and mail and sword. Still, I straightened my shoulders and approached, maintaining a calm exterior. "I am Lord Bara," I said evenly, addressing the mounted captain. "Might I ask what brings you to disturb my town with such a provocative entrance?" The captain steadied his imposing steed, its snorts punctuating the tense air. He remained mounted, looking down at me, with an unflinching gaze of a man accustomed to command. His armour, though travel-worn, gleamed faintly in the morning sun, and his words came measured but firm. "We're a battalion of 150 men of the King's army," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly across the mustering grounds. "We require food and shelter for the night as we make our way to the capital." "Ah," I nodded, my expression neutral, though my mind raced. "Of course," I replied. "Bara is a town of hospitality. We will provide you what we can." I hesitated only for a moment before venturing further. "But might I ask, Captain, what brings you so far from the heart of civilization?" There was a pause as he assessed me, the faintest flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Then, with a smooth dismount, he climbed down from his snorting beast. The sound of his boots striking the ground seemed to ripple through the air, drawing the attention of every bystander. He stepped forward, his spurs clicking softly against the cobblestones, and his voice dropped as he said, "My lord, if you will, I'd prefer to discuss this matter indoors." The gravity in his tone left little room for debate. I nodded once more, gesturing towards the keep as the weight of whatever conversation lay ahead settled heavily on my chest. "Then let us speak privately, Captain." The moment we stepped into the wooden keep, the captain wasted no time. His stride was purposeful, his movements practiced. With a sharp clatter, he removed his helm, revealing lank black hair that clung to his forehead, a scar that ran the length of his eyebrow, cutting through his expression like a permanent reminder of his trade. "We're here for you, Lord Bara," he said, his voice steady and without hesitation. "You are to accompany us to the capital. The king wishes to speak with you." He reached into his satchel and unfurled a rolled parchment, the unmistakable seal of the crown glinting in the low light. He held it out with precision, not as an offering, but as a decree that needed no further explanation. I stared at the heavy wax seal, my heart sinking. In that moment, dear listener, I knew I was done. There was no room for negotiation, no escape from the weight of the royal summons. The king's hand had reached out, and I, as ever, was subject to its grasp. The captain's voice cut through my thoughts. "We leave in the morning," he said firmly. "My men are weary from battle, my lord, and I would have them rest for the night. At your discretion." I nodded, slowly, and without eye contact, my mind racing but my outward demeanour, as best I could, composed. "Of course," I replied, though the words felt distant in my own ears. "Your men will find what comforts we can provide." The captain inclined his head slightly, acknowledging my acquiescence before stepping back. The parchment remained on the table, its weight far heavier than its physical presence. "Very well, my lord," the captain replied without further ceremony. He turned and strode towards the men, leaving me standing in the dim light of the hall with the decree staring back at me. I searched its words for answers. "The king wishes to speak with you." It gave no reason why. And so here I am, where I began, in the back of a carriage, on the way to the capital, for I know not what. The rhythmic jostling of the wheels against the uneven road is as unyielding as my thoughts. One night, just one night, is not enough to get one's affairs in order, but I made do as best I could. In case you're wondering, Lady Northbury will administer Bara in my absence. The arrangements were made hastily, but I believe I can trust her. And I have every confidence in my people to support her, as they have always supported me. A shame, really. I was just getting to know her. Still, it could be worse. I could be dead. That thought, grim as it may seem, is not without its comfort. I've long understood that in the service of kings and kingdoms, a man like me must often flirt with danger. Being summoned to the capital by a royal decree is certainly no minor thing, but at least I am alive to fret over it. So here I am, leaving Bara. Not at all as I expected. Will I be back? Who knows? But I have a feeling that the future holds surprises yet. So, as I leave my beloved town behind, I'll just say, if you have been, thank you for watching, thank you for listening. This has been Foundation, and I have been Lord Bara.